For those of you who joined us last time, you'll remember that we found Sir Jinx and lost his dad, his stepdad actually, to the trolls, and was taken in by Simon, the friendly wizard, who was not so friendly, and then also his lovely wife, who we met inside of his magic castle. And then I think right where we left off, he was just beginning to figure out how to get into the magical shop areas of it. So, all right, so we're going to continue with chapter 6. All right. Chapter 6, A Journey in the Snow. Jinx learned to read quickly, which was fortunate because Simon was not a particularly patient teacher. He didn't get angry when Jinx had trouble understanding things. Instead, he assumed that Jinx was too stupid to understand and gave up. But it didn't take long for Jinx to figure out that the letters and sounds that Simon was teaching him were actually a sort of obstacle that you had to get around in order to listen to what the book was saying. After that, reading was easy and fascinating. Jinx read about magic and about strange lands beyond the Urwald. The door to Simon's rooms were no longer locked, and now Jinx was allowed in, and had to sweep and dust those rooms as well. Jinx suspected that before, Simon had kept them swept and dusted by magic. Now he expected Jinx to do it, by broom and brush. But Jinx didn't mind because he got to watch Simon do magic, mix potions, burn dry twisty things that made purple smoke, and leaf endlessly through a red leather-bound book, muttering to himself. The wizard spent a lot of time trying different spells and, it seemed to Jinx, inventing new ones. Sometimes he wouldn't remember to tell Jinx to go to bed till nearly midnight. The stone wall that Jinx had heard Simon and Sophie walk through remained a stone wall. Jinx thought of asking Simon if he wanted Jinx to clean the rooms behind it, but he didn't dare. There was something in Simon that was like a stone wall too, and he couldn't ask the questions that led beyond it. "Don't touch any of the things on the shelves," Simon said. "They might kill you." Jinx knew now that most of the jars said danger. Sorry about that. Jinx knew now that most of the jars said danger on them and said it in larger, firmer letters than the wasp jar did. A lot of the time, Simon just sat on a high stool, boringly writing away in a book. Jinx sat on the floor beside the skull and read whatever Simon would let him. Sometimes, when he reached for a book, Simon would glance up briefly and say, "Not that one." And sometimes, if Simon said that, Jinx waited till another time when the wizard wasn't paying quite so much attention. If Simon said nothing, Jinx would take the book, open it very cautiously in case it burst into flames, and read. Some of the books were in neither Urwish or Samaran, but in some other language. This didn't matter as long as you listened to the books, he realized. He wondered how many languages there were in the world, and how many places besides the Urwald. When Sophie was visiting, she always asked Jinx about his reading. Sometimes she talked to him using the languages he'd only read in books. Jinx listened carefully. The words weren't pronounced quite the way he'd expected before answering her. "Simon, the boy's taught himself 4 languages, Sophie said. Said Simon. Some of the books they discussed were in Samaran. A lot of them were about magic, and Jinx supposed Samara must be a very magical place. But when Jinx asked Sophie questions about Samara, she frowned. "Samara's not important, Jinx. Read about the Urwald." It must be important, said Jinx. "You live there, don't you?" Sophie thought flip-floppy blue and silver thoughts, like she was nervous. "Jinx, Urwalders don't belong in Samara." "Why not?" They were speaking Samaran, and Jinx had just read a Samaran book, something about elephants, a magical beast he thought he would very much like to see. "Because we're not wanted there," Simon snapped, not looking up from his writing. "Go sweep out the loft, Jinx." Mostly Simon just left Jinx to read, except when he wanted to give him orders. "Hand me Calvin," said Simon one day. Who?" said Jinx. There was no one else in the room but the skull. It grinned conspiratorially. Simon snapped his fingers impatiently. Jinx got up and took the skull to Simon. His name is Calvin?" "It is now. Calvin's an old enemy." "Oh," said Jinx. Did you kill him by magic?" "It is very, very difficult to take someone's life by magic." "Oh," said Jinx. "I don't go around killing people," said Simon, with one of those little purplish laughing at Jinx flashes. "Well, then what happened to him?" Simon tossed the skull up in the air and set it spinning on one finger. Much less than he deserved. He didn't seem to mind the question, but he wasn't going to answer it. Oh, said Jinx, the barbarians drink wine out of the skulls of their enemies. Really? I use Calvin for a paperweight. Simon set Calvin down on the scroll he had just unrolled. Where do these barbarians live? In the blacksmith's clearing, said Jinx. Actually, anyone who lives in another clearing is a barbarian. This memory had just come to him. His clearing seemed a long time ago now, and he didn't really remember what it looked like. He wondered what exactly Calvin had done to annoy Simon. I'm not sure how people drink out of skulls, Jinx added. Calvin had too many holes in him to make a good cup. Like this, said Simon. He flipped Calvin over. You just cut around the top here, and you see you have a nice bowl. Then you add 3 legs to it to stand upright, and there you go. Oh, said Jinx, putting his hands on top of his own head. Right. The magic lessons did not go well. There did not seem to be any way to listen to magic, at least not that Jinx could figure out. He could listen to Simon, but that didn't help much. Potion and power come from the same word in Old Irwish, Simon said, holding a glass vial steadily over a candle flame with a metal clamp. All magic requires 2 things. He paused, waiting for until Jinx said, power and concentration. Right, and some kinds of magic require much more power than others. For example, magic done on a living person would require 100 times as much power as magic done on that rock you keep failing to levitate. Jinx looked at the pebble on the workbench with dislike. He'd spent weeks not being able to levitate it and was beginning to suspect Simon had done something to make it unlevitable. And some power sources are... Fire, Jinx said. And words, chants and stuff. Magic drawings with chalk, and herbs and stuff like potions. A potion enables a wizard or witch to pass magical power on to another person, said Simon. If I gave you a levitation potion, you would be able to levitate that rock, although you could do it anyway if you'd only concentrate properly. Jinx glared at the pebble as hard as he could. Spells were much easier to do if you could keep your eyes on the objects you were bespelling, according to Simon. Why can't I have a power source? If he could just draw on power from a chant or a chalk drawing, Jinx thought, he'd be able to raise the pebble. A simple spell like that shouldn't require one. Simon jiggled the vial over the flame, agitating the dark green contents. If you can't do that, you'll certainly never be able to do the concealment spell to protect you in the forest, which you need if you're going to keep running around off the path like you do. I want to learn it so that I can go places, Jinx said. Well, you'll never learn at this rate. You'll be stuck right here like a lump of lichen. Sophie says you should be more patient when you're teaching me. Simon frowned. Nonsense. I'm extremely patient. You've taken weeks to learn this simple spell and... You keep calling me an idiot, said Jinx. I have certainly never called you an idiot. Simon took a tiny bird made of gold from his pocket and let a drop of the potion fall on it. The bird glowed brightly for an instant. Simon blew on it and then picked it up and handed it to Jinx. There. The gold was surprisingly heavy in Jinx's hand. It's called an aviot, said Simon. If you insist on going places, take it with you. Is it magic? Obviously. Don't tell Sophie about it. She doesn't need to know. Sophie likes magic, Jinx said. It's just that she doesn't like that she likes it, because she thinks she shouldn't. Figured that out, have you? Jinx hadn't needed to figure it out. It was right in front of Sophie's head for anyone to see. Magic is knowledge, said Simon, and Sophie has a great respect for knowledge. Knowledge is power, said Jinx. A frozen block of surprise surrounded Simon. Where did you get that from? Get what from? Knowledge is power. Jinx frowned. Where had he got it from? Sophie said it one time, and it made her mad. Is the aviat like a concealment spell? No, it's not as strong. Is it some sort of, talisman for luck? Something like that. Don't worry, I'll find another way to keep you safe. There was something peculiar about the words. They were all tangled up in gray in Simon's thoughts, and keep you seemed to mean something on its own, separate from safe. I don't want to be kept, said Jinx. He wanted to go, somewhere. It's actually necessary when you're little, said Simon. Sounds as if he were arguing with himself about something. When you're grown up, you'll be able to protect yourself from things. I'm 10, said Jinx. But Simon wasn't listening. The wizard's thoughts were crawling around, hiding behind one another, and it made Jinx nervous. Simon picked up the still-burning candle and set it down next to the immovable pebble. Here, use the power from the flame to levitate the rock. If you can't do that, you're hopeless. There were still days at a time when Jinx was alone, because Simon would go off somewhere in the Urwald. Jinx was used to being by himself, and it didn't bother him as much as it used to, but he wished he could go too. He asked to be taken along, but Simon always refused. Once, when the wizard was in an especially cloudy, dark mood, he said, "If you don't stop asking me, I will take you." Which was what Jinx wanted, but it sounded like a threat. A few months later, Simon came home with a burn on his face and a purple-green cloud of despair around his head. Jinx asked what had happened. Nothing, Simon snapped. Mind your own business. But the closed-off shape of Simon's thoughts made Jinx think it had something to do with the Bone Master. Jinx wondered if Simon had been battling with him. Whenever Simon got on his nerves, Jinx went to the far-seeing window and talked things over with the girl in the red hood. The window showed her to him often, though only from a distance. He imagined her with yellow curly hair and sky-blue eyes, which he couldn't see from above because of her hood, and very sympathetic. He could actually tell me how to do things, Jinx said after a particularly frustrating magic lesson. He just barks at me and expects me to know what he's talking about. He must know how the magic is done. Why can't he just tell me? It's completely unfair, said the red-caped girl, in Jinx's imagination. And the other day he says to me, why is it that witches can do magic on living people more easily than wizards can? And I said, I don't know. Then I wait for him to tell me, right? But instead he goes, oh, I was hoping you would know. And I go, well, why can they? And he says, I don't know. And I say, how am I supposed to know if you don't? And he goes, I thought you might use your brain. How am I supposed to use my brain to know things that he doesn't? I don't know how you put up with it, said the red-caped girl, somewhat admiringly. Oh well, he's mostly not that bad, said Jinx. He made me a good luck charm to keep me safe from the forest. I think you're awfully brave to go out into Urwald by yourself, said the girl. Oh, well, I'm not scared of it. After all, it's where we live, right? That's why we know to be scared of it, said the girl. Jinx spent a lot of time in the forest with his toes in the dirt, listening to the tree roots. He was getting better at understanding them. The thoughts of the roots of trees crawled with worms and grubs, sucked at moisture and wriggled at anthills. Still, it was company. The trees called people, and all other sorts of creatures, the restless. They called Jinx the listener. Those weren't the exact words, but they were the general idea and the closest Jinx could get to it in human talk. The restless didn't interest them much, but they mentioned them now and then as annoyances, pressures on their root hairs, travelers on the path, werewolves skulking in the moonlight, vampires pretending to be travelers, and trolls tearing their way through the Urwald, not caring if they broke someone's branches or ripped someone's bark. These scraps of stories made Jinx nervous, but he wanted to see more of the world, and so he would wander farther and farther into the forest, always checking to make sure that he knew the way back to Simon's house, always listening for footsteps or the shuffle of anything dangerous. One day the trees were alarmed. Some restless just off the path were cutting up fallen trees for firewood, and not the right fallen trees. They were chopping up fine old trunks that the trees had actually been planning to eat themselves. The Urwald was angry. Jinx crunched his way through the undergrowth until he came to the path. A party of wanderers was camped there, busily chopping up fallen trees with axes. Stop! Jinx yelled. The wanderers looked up. It's that wizard's kid. It's that wizard's kid, a boy said in his own language, and not nicely. Jinx clambered up on the enormous dead trunk and the boy was hacking at. You can't have this one. Take that one over there. It's crushing some saplings anyways, he pointed. Who taught you to speak, wanderer? Said one of the women. You guys did, said Jinx. But that's not important. What's important is that you can't chop this tree up or the Urwald will get mad and take some awful kind of revenge on you. Says who? Said the boy. Says the Urwald, said Jinx. If you cut off the limbs of this tree, people will lose their limbs. The trees said so. Oh, wonderful. He talks to trees, said the woman, but she dragged her axe over to the other dead trunk. Don't hurt those saplings, said Jinx as the other wanderers followed her. Bosses people around like he's a bloody wizard himself, the woman muttered. The boy hung back.
What's your name?
Jinx. What's yours?
Tolliver. How old are you?
11, said Jinx.
No, you are not. I'm 11. You're little.
I was 11 at the winter solstice. Jinx was littler than Tolliver. This worried him.
How did an evil wizard catch you?
Said Tolliver. I just met him in the forest one time. He's not evil.
What does he use you for? Does he drink your blood?
Wizards don't drink blood, said Jinx. Vampires do that.
But he uses it in spells, right? Wizards use people's blood and livers and things in spells. Everybody knows that.
Then everybody's wrong. Simon doesn't do that. I've watched him do lots of spells, and he hasn't used even one person's liver.
Can you do spells?
Yes, Jinx lied. Then, realizing Tolliver was about to ask him to do one, he added, I'm not allowed to in front of other people, though.
Oh, yeah?
Tolliver grinned, and Jinx saw that he knew Jinx was lying.
If you can do magic, you better stay out of the kingdoms. You know what they do to magicians there. They make them dance in red-hot iron shoes.
They do not.
You too. I've seen it.
You have not. Jinx was almost sure Tolliver was lying. His thoughts were a purple cloud of laughing at Jinx. Well, as long as he was going to be laughed at anyways. What are the kingdoms?
Man, you never heard of the kingdoms?
That's why I asked, said Jinx. None of the books he'd read had mentioned them.
They're all around the Urwald. The biggest ones are Keyland and Bragwood. Keyland's that way.
Tolliver pointed to the east.
And Bragwood is that way.
He pointed west. So, what's that way? Said Jinx, pointing south.
Keyland, mostly. And a little bit of Bragwood.
And what about that way? Jinx pointed north.
Oh, all kinds of kingdoms,
said Tolliver airily, so Jinx guessed he didn't know.
Anyway, you want to stay out of Keyland. They'll kill any kind of magician there. They kill everybody. The king killed his brother.
Kings are just in stories, said Jinx.
No, they're not. Shut up and listen. The king killed his brother, who was actually king, so that he could be king. Then the dead king's wife and baby disappeared. On account the baby would have been king, so the brother probably killed them too. They do that kind of thing all the time, kings do. They can kill anybody they like.
What do you want to be in a place like that for? Said Jinx.
Man, that's where everything comes from. That's where you get that paper that your wizard likes so much, and that blue cloth you're wearing. When you outgrow your clothes, if you do, we'll sell them to some other clearing, and then they'll wear them out, and we'll sell them back to Keyland to be made into paper. Haven't you ever been anywhere?
Of course, said Jinx.
Where?
Oh, around?
If you never go anywhere, you'll always be stupid,
said Tolliver. I'm not stupid, said Jinx, but he could see Tolliver's point. Tolliver clearly knew all sorts of things that Jinx didn't, and it was probably from having been places. I can't do it! Jinx pushed away the book he'd been trying to levitate. Of course you can't, if you think you can't, said Simon. I know I can't. Bah! Even worse, don't waste my time, said Simon. You levitated a rock, a bottle, and a spoon. What's the problem? The book weighs more, so draw on more power. I don't have more power. Simon uttered one of his favorite swear words. Use the fire. You always got the fire. The fire was the only spell Jinx had managed to learn besides levitation. He could set things on fire, and then put the fire out by reabsorbing it into himself, as long as it wasn't a big fire. And whenever the fire wasn't burning, it was inside Jinx. This, in itself, was power, according to Simon. A very small power. I can't find the fire, said Jinx. Of course you can, it's right there. Simon pointed at Jinx. Can't you feel it? No, said Jinx, frustrated. No, said Jinx, frustrated. Simon kept insisting power was something you could sense, practically see, and Jinx had no idea what he meant. Jinx couldn't open and close doors with magic. He couldn't use magic to split firewood. He couldn't levitate any living thing. He tried on kittens, because its life force countermanded what little power he had. He certainly couldn't make illusions, and worst of all, he couldn't do the concealment spell that Simon had used to save himself and Jinx from the trolls. Can we try the concealment spell again? Said Jinx. For whatever good that'll do. Go ahead. How am I supposed to think I can do it when you know I can't? Jinx didn't say this. He went to the middle of the room, stood in the center, and tried to draw on power from the fire inside him. Power and concentration. He concentrated hard on not being there. No good, said Simon. You're as there as you ever were. I don't have enough magic. Magic isn't something you have, it's something you do. Or in your case, don't do.
I can understand the trees, though, said Jinx, defending himself.
Nonsense. Simon turned back to his books.
I can too. They told me...
Jinx remembered his conversation with Tolliver.
Are there countries outside the Urwald?
Of course.
With kings? Bragwood and Keyland?
Among others, yes. Among others, yes.
Why aren't they in your books?
Oh, they're in there somewhere. They're just not very interesting places, said Simon.
Why are so many books about the Urwald?
Because it's more interesting, of course, said Simon, flipping open a book. If you're not going to do the concealment spell, go muck out the goat shed.
Jinx remembered something else Tolliver had said. Do you think I'm small?
Of course you're...
Simon stopped and looked down at Jinx in surprise, as if he hadn't seen him in a long time.
Didn't you used to be a lot smaller?
Well, yes, said Jinx, because I used to be 6.
Well, how old are you now?
11. You made pumpkin pie on my birthday, Jinx reminded him. But am I too small?
No, you'll grow.
Simon's thoughts were twisting around again, crawling over one another. If Jinx was worried about not growing, it seemed like Simon was just as worried about him growing. For some weeks after that, Simon took to paging furiously through stacks of books about magic. But when Jinx asked him what he was looking for, Simon just grunted or told him to go sweep out the loft. It was ages before Simon finally agreed to take Jinx on one of his journeys. Where are we going?
If you're going to pester me the whole lot of questions, I'll leave you at home.
Jinx didn't think just asking where they were going counted as pestering, but he shut up. The next thing he'd been going to ask was, does this have something to do with the Bone Master? Simon didn't have the green bottle-shaped fear of the Bone Master that most people did, but his Bone Master thoughts tended to be angry, and for some reason now they were mixed up with those worries about Jinx growing. Anyways, Jinx was finally going somewhere. That was the important thing. They walked all the short winter day. There were tracks in the snow on the path, stamped in by boots, claws, and cloven hooves. Once they met a man carrying an axe over his shoulder and thought he was probably just a woodcutter. You could never be too sure in the Urwald. Jinx drew closer to Simon and was gratified by the look of terror the stranger cast at the wizard. They passed each other without speaking. The winter day was never very bright, and it darkened quickly.
Here we go, said Simon, stopping suddenly. We'll spend the night in this treehouse.
Jinx looked up through the branches laced with snow, purple in the gathering dusk. He could make out a sort of box.
Now, to figure out how to get up, said Simon.
There was a distant thumping sound from farther up the path. Something's coming, said Jinx.
Mm-hmm,
said Simon, ignoring him. He ran his hands over the tree trunk. The thumping grew louder. A small thump followed by a bigger one. Ker-thump, ker-thump. It's something big and heavy, Jinx added.
It looks like if I boost you up, you could probably grab that broken branch up there, said Simon. When you get up there to the treehouse, you can tie this rope to a branch and I'll climb up.
It's getting closer, said Jinx.
Well, hurry up then, boy. Don't dawdle.
Simon handed Jinx a coil of rope and made a stirrup in his hands.
Ouch. You could have brushed the snow off your boots.
With the rope looped over his shoulder, Jinx teetered one-footed in Simon's hand and groped for the broken branch Simon had pointed out. His hands closed around the rough bark. He tried to pull himself up. The thumping grew louder.
Brace your feet against the trunk and walk your way up, said Simon.
Jinx did. He managed to get up and put his knee on the branch. Then, wrapping his arms around as much of the trunk as he could reach, he got his foot up. Ker-thump, ker-thump. He stood up against the tree trunk and scrambled onto the wooden platform of the treehouse.
Ker-thump. You can send the rope down any time,
Simon snapped. Jinx tied the rope to a branch as quickly as he could. The thumping was so close now that he could hear it crunching snow on the path. He threw the free end of the rope down. It snagged on a broken branch. Thump! He shook it free and saw it go slack as it dropped. Then it tightened. Thump! Thump! Whatever it was right at the foot of the tree. Simon's head appeared over the side of the platform. Jinx wilted with relief. That creature can't climb trees, can it?
Won't, more like, said Simon. There she goes. See?
Jinx peered through the gloaming between two great branches and could just make out the hopping motion of a legless barrel shape, thrusting a long, straight stick at the ground.
A witch traveling by butter churn, said Simon.
Oh, said Jinx. He was ashamed of being so frightened. You're not afraid of witches, are you?
Only an idiot wouldn't be afraid of witches, said Simon. I never knew there were tree houses, said Jinx. He was surprised the trees would allow such a thing. Part of the ancient treaty. I never heard of an ancient treaty, said Jinx. The trees had never mentioned it. The trees agreed to let the humans take deadwood for fuel and building, and to let us have tree houses, and we agreed that if anyone kills a tree, the trees take a human life in revenge. Simon shook his head. I never saw the point of that. The trees don't want to just take anybody's life, said Jinx, but they're afraid of letting there get to be too many humans. For a long time, Jinx couldn't sleep because of the cold, and he could tell that Simon was awake too by the quiet murmur of Simon's thoughts. There was a sort of eager galloping feeling of being about to accomplish something new, something to do with magic, Jinx thought. He'd sensed this feeling of Simon's before when the wizard was working on a new spell or trying out some magic one of the witches had told him about. But this time there was an odd pucker of guilt around the edge of excitement. Maybe the guilt was because Simon was thinking of Sophie and how much she disliked magic, but that didn't explain why Simon had it about this spell. Come to think of it, Jinx had never noticed him feeling guilty before. Not about magic, not about what Sophie didn't like, not about Calvin the Skull, not about anything. It was hard to imagine what would make Simon feel guilty, but it would probably have to be something pretty bad. Chapter 7, The Bone Master. Chapter 7, The Bone Master. It was early the next afternoon that they crossed a 2-log bridge over a creek and started down a smaller, snow-covered path dented with butter-churn tracks. Soon they came to a little thatch-covered cottage. The house was made of wood, not gingerbread, but the butter-churn tracks went right up to the door, so Jinx knew they were visiting a witch. Simon had told him that only an idiot wouldn't be afraid of witches, and one thing Simon certainly did not consider himself was an idiot. But then Simon had witches visiting in his house all the time. But going to a witch's house? That was different. They had not yet reached the door when it opened and Dame Glamour stepped out.
Simon the Wizard, she said, come to see me through long miles of snowy woods. I wonder why.
Greetings, Dame Glamour, said Simon with a smile.
And the dear little chipmunk is still alive, she grinned at Jinx.
May we come in? Said Simon.
Oh, of course, where are my manners?
Dame Glamour stepped back.
Come in, take off your boots, have some brew.
The house seemed small inside when you were used to Simon's, but it had a scrubbed wood floor and a fire crackling in the fireplace. They took off their boots and their coats and sat down on proper wooden table, centuries old and unlikely to offend any living tree much. Dame Glamour set hot mugs of something in front of them. Leaves floated in it. Jinx cupped his hands around the mug and breathed in leaf-smelling steam. He listened to Simon and Dame Glamour talk about the journey, about the weather, not about what they'd come for, and Jinx had no idea what that might be, but the little pucker of guilt that he'd noticed in Simon last night had come back. In Dame Glamour, he couldn't feel anything at all, no matter how hard he tried.
Well, I won't rush you to tell me what you've come about, Simon, said Dame Glamour, but I don't think it was to gaze upon my beautiful face. And you, Chipmunk, can stop trying to read my mind.
I wasn't trying to read your mind, Jinx protested. I can't. Nobody can.
That's right, Chipmunk. Nobody can.
Confused, Jinx ducked his head down and breathed in the steam. He took a cautious sip of the hot drink. It tasted of summer. Dame Glamour got up and brought some barley cakes, which were crumbly and a bit stale and nowhere near as good as anything that there was to eat in Simon's house. They ate these and drank their brew, and Simon and Dame Glamour talked a bit about potions and magic and herbs.
That's deep Urwald magic, that is, Simon, said Dame Glamour, nodding at Jinx. You don't see that very often. If you want to study Urwald magic, you take a look at that boy.
No one can read minds, said Simon. Certainly Jinx can't. Dame Glamour grinned.
Ask him.
Jinx, what number am I thinking of?
7?
Jinx guessed. Nope. Simon turned back to Dame Glamour. I'd have noticed it by now if he could.
Hard to notice what you don't believe in.
Jinx, go bring in some firewood, said Simon. Jinx put down his empty mug and stood up. It didn't seem fair. He'd only just got here, and surely Dame Glamour was used to bringing in her own firewood.
The firewood's in a shed down just around the side of the house, Chipmunk, said Dame Glamour, grinning at him.
He pulled his boots on, put on his coat, and went out. He took a couple of loud, crunching steps in the snow, forward, then back, and then pressed his ear to Dame Glamour's front door.
Of course I don't,
Dame Glamour was saying.
"Do you think I keep something like that in my house?"
"Probably," said Simon.
"Ha! Nobody ever wanted that for any good purpose."
"I'd be willing to pay quite a bit for it."
"And it's the leaves you want."
"The roots," said Simon. "I told you."
"Roots magics for things that ought to not see the light of day, things that were better left undone,"
said Dame Glamour. "Am I supposed to believe you never do that sort of magic yourself?" said Simon. Dame Glamour chuckled. "I'll pay you in gold," said Simon.
"Gold?"
Dame Glamour laughed.
"That useless soft metal that you can't make tools or cooking pots out of? Or am I supposed to hang it on my beautiful ears?"
"Well, not gold then. Anything you like."
"Anything?"
Dame Glamour's voice was suddenly hungry. "Within reason," Simon said quickly. "Anything you care to name right now. No unspecified favors at a later date."
"Will you give me the dear, trusting little chipmunk?"
"No, not the chipmunk," said Simon. "I meant something in the way of money, or spices, or—"
"Magic?"
said Dame Glamour.
"Goodness, don't you think that chipmunk's taking an awfully long time with the wood?"
There was the sound of a chair being pushed back from the table, and Jinx turned and ran to get the firewood.
"You'd better stay the night,"
said Dame Glamour when Jinx was back inside.
"Now that the deepest snow is gone, a lot of folk are out traveling the path. I expect you might meet anybody."
"Might we?" said Simon. "Meaning?"
"Meaning there are some people it's better to meet by daylight."
Simon nodded slowly. "I see. Right. We'll stay then." Before they left the next morning, Jinx saw Dame Glamour slip Simon a bundle tied up tightly in a red polka dot kerchief. Simon tucked it into an inside pocket of his robe. Jinx didn't see what Simon gave her in exchange. They walked home by a different route. Every time they came to another path, Simon stopped and looked down at each way as if they were expecting someone. "Well, look at that," said Simon at the 7th crossing. There was another wizard coming along the path. He looked like wizards should look. He had long white beard and blue eyes crackling with sparks, and he wore a blue robe with a matching pointy hat. He was smiling, which didn't go with the flashing pink clouds of fury that gathered around him like a rose-colored thunderstorm. "What are you doing out of your lair, Bone Master?" said Simon. So this was the Bone Master, the wizard of horrible tales and bottle-shaped fears. He looked almost kindly. The things boiling in clouds around his head said that he wasn't, though. The pink clouds had knives in them. Jinx had never seen anyone whose feelings came out in cutlery before. Jinx would have been sure he was about to die if Simon hadn't been there. "Not looking for you, certainly, Simon," said the Bone Master. "But since we met so pleasantly, why don't you go to your house and collect what you stole from me?" "No," said Simon, "not even in exchange for what you stole from me." "Oh, did I offer that? Anyway, I stole nothing," said the Bone Master. "I took what was owed." "Step off the path and I'll give you what was owed." Big talk, Simon, as usual. But you can't fight me. You haven't the power. That burns here nicely, I see." The wizards were boiling rage at each other now. The Bone Master continued to look faintly amused, but the knives in the pink clouds spun about hungrily. The Bone Master flicked his eyes at Jinx. "Got a boy, have you? And just big enough to be of use, I see." Simon stepped in front of Jinx. "It's not your business." "Well, it won't work, Simon. You haven't the power or the intelligence to make it work, let alone the ability to finish what you start. I always said so." They glared at each other, Simon with mounting fury and the Bone Master with cool disapproval. 3 of the knives in the pink clouds were now gently dripping blood. "Come on, Jinx," said Simon, turning away. "Yeah, go on, Jinx," said the Bone Master. Don't call him by name," Simon snarled. He grabbed Jinx by the arm and stalked off along the path. Jinx looked over his shoulder, afraid the Bone Master was going to follow them and suck out their souls. The Bone Master just stood there, looking after them and smiling. Simon was in a red rage. Jinx waited till it had faded to a dull orange before asking, "Was that really the Bone Master?" "Obviously." "I always heard he was a really evil wizard." "You heard right." "He looks—" "Don't judge people by how they look," said Simon. "And don't ever go near him, Jinx. Ever." "No fear of that? Who would? Nobody would ever be fooled by the Bone Master's smile. He had knives in his thoughts." "I'm sure he does."
It's lucky for us we weren't off the path, said Jinx.
Oh, you think he could have hurt us? You think that he's a more powerful wizard than I am? Is that what you think?
No,
said Jinx, who had been thinking exactly that. Anyone could have the power the way he gets it, if they were willing to do the things he's willing to do, which I am not.
Oh, what?
And I don't owe him a thing.